Welcome to the Kev Talks podcast. I am your host, Kevin Lee, and with me is a guest speaker and literary expert, Ian Dolan, and today we're going to analyze a chapter from a very interesting piece of work. The book is called The Things They Carried, and the chapter we'll be analyzing is How to Tell a True War Story. A true war story makes the audience feel like they're in Vietnam. O'Brien does this through narrative techniques, symbols, tone, and syntax. So, Mr. Dolan, please tell us all about this chapter.
Please, call me Ian. Mr. Dolan is my father.
My apologies, Ian. Please tell us about the chapter.
So, in a whole, the chapter titled How to Tell a True War Story is about all the factors that make up a true war story. For example, O'Brien writes on page 65 that a true war story is never moral. As the chapter goes on, O'Brien lifts off other characteristics that a true war story has, such as the fact that the reader or listener can't get the meaning, or how the writer or speaker can't generalize war.
Interesting, Ian. I'm afraid I don't understand. In what ways is a war story never moral?
By moral, I mean that it does not try to teach you a lesson. The goal for the anecdote is not to teach you to brush your teeth or to eat your vegetables. It is not a fable. The first anecdote told in the chapter does not have any moral to it. It is simply a story about a soldier, Rat Kiley, who wrote a letter to the sister of his best friend, Kurt Lemon, who was killed in Vietnam, and she didn't write back. That's it. There are no lessons to that story. In addition, the entire chapter, Sweetheart of Song Trebong, has no lesson. It is a completely true story about the unbelievable events that changed Mark Fosse's girlfriend.
Ian, I have another question. I don't understand the point of the water buffalo. What was the point of it? Why was it a love story?
The water buffalo is an anecdote. On the surface, the story is about Rat torturing a water buffalo, but beneath, the story is about how much the loss of Kurt Lemon affected Rat. Let me explain. The reason O'Brien says that the story about the baby water buffalo is not a story, but a love story, is that the entire story is a symbol trying to give off the atmosphere of how Rat felt after losing his best friend. O'Brien uses phrases like stroked his nose and leaned forward and whispered something, as if talking to a pet, to help strengthen the fact that he loved Kurt and felt like he was a brother. To contrast this comparison, O'Brien also writes, squatted down and shot it in the left front knee. Again, the animal fell hard and tried to get up, but this time it couldn't quite make it. These lines show the anger and frustration that Rat felt after losing his best friend. Kurt dying brought him to his knees, much like how he brought the baby buffalo to its knees.
The book mentions on page 68 that a true war story cannot be believed. How does that apply to the chapter of the dentist?
The chapter, The Dentist, is a story about how Kurt Lemon is in the waiting room of the dentist's office. When the dentist eventually calls his name, he faints right there on the spot. Upon reawakening, Kurt goes in to see the dentist, and the dentist sees nothing wrong with his teeth. Kurt refuses to believe this and eventually makes the dentist pull one of his perfectly good teeth. The anecdote seems so insane and just downright ridiculous that one can say that it is not even true. However, O'Brien tells us that a war story cannot be believed, and that's exactly what The Dentist is. It's a completely true war story that drops the jaw. It is so crazy. Some may think that Kurt was insane or had lost his marbles, when in fact the public is mostly to blame. Often war veterans are seen to be proud, brave, hardy, heroic men that are afraid of nothing and resent to no one or no thing. Kurt was only trying to preserve this image by showing that he was rough or brave enough to make it through a messy dentist checkup. He wanted everyone to know, soldiers and civilians, that he was afraid of nothing, especially not some silly dentist.
Why do you think Tim O'Brien uses the narrative technique of bounces around a lot in this chapter between how a war story is and various anecdotes? I noticed that he seemed to also do this in other chapters.
The chapter, How to Tell a True War Story, is structured where he gives a description of a true war story or two, and then backs it up by giving a true war story that he heard or experienced that fits one or more of the described characteristics. So in pages 66 through 68, O'Brien writes that a true war story embarrasses you and that it is hard to separate what happened from what seems to happen. He then goes on to apply both of these characteristics to the story of Kurt Lemon stepping on a landmine and being blown to bits into a tree. To make this story fit the characteristic of embarrassment, O'Brien spares no single detail of imagery as he retells climbing up the tree and pulling down Kurt's intestines. In addition, he tells of how when the detonator went off, the natural reaction would be to cover your face and look away, and that when doing so, you seem to float out above your body and the pictures get jumbled, and when you go back to retell it, there is a false trueness that in fact makes it all the truer.
I know there seems to be an endless amount of questions, but there's just a few more. How does the author's syntax affect the chapter?
In the first anecdote on page 64 to 65, the author's syntax helps slow down the story and drag it out with sentences such as, "He says he loved the guy," and "This is true." The multiple quotes from Rat Kiley also make the reader get the feeling of personalities and how close Rat was to Kurt Lemon. The second anecdote on page 66 that explains Kurt's death is different. This follows Tim's regular style of multiple short lines, then followed with the longest line you have ever seen in your life. Just like Tim's normal style, the long lines are also filled with an abundance of imagery, ranging from visual imagery to auditory imagery. This structure also helps separate the anecdote from the first because the syntax felt as if the first had belonged to Rat and the second actually and truly belonged to the author, Tim O'Brien.
Okay, Ian, one last question. What was the tone and how did it affect the chapter as a whole?
Well, the tone kind of varies for each of the different stories. The story about Rat writing the letter to Kurt's sister starts out sad and then moves on to frustration when Rat never receives a response. The sadness was expressed through lines such as, "Rat almost bawls writing it," on page 64. Then it turns to frustration when it explains, "The dumb coos never writes back." Now, the anecdote about Kurt Lemon's death was just somber, calm, and serious. O'Brien expresses that with lines such as, "Things were quiet," and using shade into sunlight. The anecdote from Mitchell Sanders was almost incredulous or skeptical because of lines like "God's truth" and banter of "You won't believe." The tones at times help follow the rules of the war story that O'Brien sets. A good example is the Mitchell Sanders anecdote. Tim said that a true war story, in many cases, cannot be believed. Then his example was the anecdote that immediately starts with "God's truth" and with a tone that reeks unbelievableness.
Alright, Ian, it was a pleasure having you here today.
The pleasure was all mine.
Well, that's all for today, folks. We'll see you next time for more on Kev Talks.